Monday, we talked about applying CSS, and we learned that there are 3 different ways to apply CSS to our HTML. The way we learned on Monday was called inline styles. What are one of the other 2 ways? Embedded is another one. What's the other one? External. Okay. This week we're still going to stick with inline styles. Next week we're going to start learning embedded styles. In order for us to apply CSS using inline styles, what do we need to add to our HTML tags? Yeah, there's something that we have to add specifically to the opening tag, which is, yeah, a style attribute. Okay, yeah, that thing. A style attribute is required. Now, inside of that style attribute, the value for that attribute, we place CSS properties. And a property basically is our vocabulary for CSS, right? Now, I gave you a couple of rules when using inline styles. I mentioned that every single tag can have a style attribute applied to it, right? How many different style attributes can each element have? 1. Good. Just make sure. I'm going to keep hammering that home. Now, the properties, the CSS properties, basically there's a specific property name, and that is the style that you are actually affecting a change in. And then a value. And that value can be different depending on what the actual property that you're applying. What we learned on Monday was basically how we can change the color of our text or the background color of an element. And we learned a little bit more about that from the standpoint of we could set it by basically just giving it the color name, or we can use hexadecimal notation to set a color. Now, when it comes to the color names, I mentioned that even though you have a wide array of different color names that are available, what's the problem with using or relying on color names?
Not every website reads it.
Not necessarily website.
I mean, the browser.
Yeah, the browser. Not every browser really understands or applies the same color for the same word, and that's a problem. However, there are 5 colors, though, that I said are okay to use because every browser renders them the same way. What are those 5 colors?
Red, green, black, white, red.
Yes, that's it. You got them all. There you go. Yeah. Red, green, blue, black, and white. Okay? So those are the 5. And the reason for that is that the way that we actually define colors on the web is we use the RGB color mode. And because of this, when you tell the browser red, because RGB is basically 3 different values, a value of red, a value of green, and a value of blue, when you say, I want red, it gives you full red, which is the same in every browser. Full red in one browser is the same as full red in another browser, and full red in a third browser. Same thing with green and blue. And the same thing goes for black or white. Black, in the case of RGB, is basically no red, no green, no blue. And that's the same in every browser. Red and white is the opposite. Full red, full green, full blue, and that's the same in every browser. So those 5 colors are perfectly fine to just use the name of the color. I'm not expecting you at any point in time in the semester, if you need to make something black, to have to actually figure out what the hexadecimal notation for that is. Of course, that's pretty simple. It should be pound sign or hashtag or number sign or whatever, tic-tac-toe board, whatever you want to call it, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. But the hexadecimal notation that we learned on Monday, which, by the way, how many people found that to at least be slightly helpful when understanding what you're looking at? Okay. How many people are still confused on how hexadecimal actually works? Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Okay. You'll get a little bit more practice on that today. The hexadecimal color value that we learned on Monday is going to be your primary use whenever you need to set a color value in CSS. So, I mentioned, though, on Monday that I'm not expecting you to kind of go through the whole, division, modulus, the whole machinations of switching from base 10 to base 16 math, which I got an email on Monday night where somebody was like, I didn't even know there were different forms of math. Well, I'm glad I was at least able to introduce you. And I'm sure I caused some nightmares over the last couple of days as well, so I apologize for that. But I wasn't expecting you for the rest of the semester to have to actually do a conversion from base 10 to base 16 every time I gave you an RGB value. And what I said on Monday was there's an easier way to find what the actual hexadecimal color value is. And what did I mention? What application did I say you could use? Photoshop. Absolutely. Now, yeah, we did talk about that little, the color digital meter. That's fine, or digital color meter. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about specifically if I give you an RGB value, how can you find the hexadecimal without going through the math? Just open up Photoshop and plug in those RGB values in the color picker, and the color picker will tell you exactly what the hexadecimal value is for that. And that's important for a couple of reasons. Number one, obviously, just so that you don't have to go through the math, because sometimes when you're going and doing that ridiculous amount of math, you can make a mistake and you get the color wrong. But more importantly, a lot of times when you're working with a client, you'll be given branding guidelines. And those branding guidelines will often include things like a CMYK color for the brand or an RGB color for the brand. Nowadays, it's usually considered proper that when you are creating a style guide for a particular brand to also include a hexadecimal value. But I've run into many that do not. So if you're given a specific branding guideline for a client and it says this logo needs to be in this color, and the color is a CMYK color or an RGB color, all you have to do is jump into Photoshop, type that color value in, and it'll automatically spit out a hexadecimal value. Now, I will tell you this, because of the conversion from things like CMYK to RGB, if you're given only a CMYK color, the resulting hexadecimal value will be a conversion and it won't be precise. Okay? Anytime you try to transfer a CMYK color to RGB, there's going to be some things that are kind of lost in that conversion. And the same thing goes from CMYK to hexadecimal, because hexadecimal is RGB. So if you're given branded guidelines and you only have two color values that are given, a CMYK and an RGB value, use the RGB value to create your hexadecimal. Questions about this? All right, so with that being said, let me introduce you to additional color values that you can set. Now, I mentioned on Monday, as we were talking about properties in CSS, the values of those properties can vary depending on what kind of property you're using. The color property we've already learned can have two different formats of values, right? The name of the color or a hexadecimal color value. I'm going to give you two additional formats for our individual values. So, and by the way, this doesn't matter what color property, whether it's color or background color, this applies to both. Anytime you need a color value, we can rely on these particular formats. So, I could, if I wanted to say express red, of course, I can use the color name. And we learned on Monday about hexadecimal that I want to go ahead and create red. By the way, what is the hexadecimal value for red?
255.0.0.
No, not the RGB value, the hexadecimal value.
That's a very good question.
It is a good question. That's why I asked it.
10,
Nope.
196. No,
Not FA.
whatever.
First off, what is the symbol to start a hexadecimal value? Hashtag, pound sign, octothorpe, whatever you want to call it.
It won't be off the phone.
Octothorpe's its actual name. I'm not making that up.
But we believe you.
Well, that's good. I wouldn't lie to you much. So, starts off, if you want to say hashtag, that's fine. Whatever. Hashtag. Now, how many digits make up a hexadecimal value?
6.
6. Very good. So 3 pairs, right? First pair is red, second pair is green, third pair is blue. Agreed? Okay. When you have a full RGB color value, if I'm just talking non-hexadecimal RGB, it's 255, right? In hexadecimal, a full color value is FF. Okay? Because if you remember 0 through F, base 16, if the last 2 digits are the same, that's a full value. So FF is the full value.
0, 0, 0.
And then no green and no blue. So that is the same as red. Okay? That works. What I'm going to show you are 2 additional ways of setting the same color. The 4th way is going to throw a little curveball into this. Allows us to do something slightly different. So let's talk about the 3rd way. The first 2 will work in every browser across the board, going all the way back to the very beginning. And I do mean going back all the way to the beginning. If you somehow were to, get your hands on a computer running the next operating system and have a copy of Sir Tim Berners-Lee original World Wide Web browser, those 2 values would eventually work, or at least the hexadecimal and red. The CSS wouldn't work. There's other ways you can apply that in HTML that are no longer valid, but those color values will work. This 3rd way works in all modern browsers. And what I mean by modern browsers, browsers that have been created in the last 6 to 7 years. Now, for many of you, 6 to 7 years is a long time. I said for many of you. I didn't say for all of you. I said for many of you. 6 or 7 years ago seems a long time ago. And most of you probably don't have phones older than 2 years. And to have a device that is older than 7 years seems just far-fetched. But you would be surprised, there are many millions of individuals that are still using the internet on devices that are at least 10 years old, if not older. So, one of the things that we're going to learn is, and that kind of goes back to that Can I Use website that I linked to on Canvas, almost at Blackboard, is that we have to be aware that certain decisions that we make in either the CSS properties that we use or the values that we set are not going to be compatible with every single browser. And we have to have a trade-off. So in other words, there are certain things that we may want to do with our layout that target and allow for 98% of all the browsers out there to be able to do, but there's 2% that won't do it. So does that mean we can't do that? Well, no. There's a trade-off there. That 2% that's running on Windows 98, at this point in time, should at least be comfortable with the fact when they surf the internet, it's going to look horrible. Right? Because they're using very, very old technology. It would be just like anybody today rolling around with a simple flip phone, right? Not expecting to be able to order Papa John's online. Do we understand that? Like, the expectation of the user is such that it's okay if a very small percentage can't view the website the way that you intended. That's fine. Okay, there's limitations. However, this next color value has a adoption rate in the browser industry of around 75 to 80%, which means you can have upwards to 1 out of every 5 user not being able to actually use this value. So you see how that now suddenly going from 2% to 20%, well, now we really have to think about whether or not we want to do this. And the decisions that you make, and this is something we'll talk about in Web 2, the decisions that you make as to whether or not you want to use this particular value will kind of boil down to who the intended audience is for your website. So for instance, if I'm doing a website for, say, Mercedes-Benz, do you think that the typical audience, the user that's going to go to a Mercedes-Benz website, is going to be surfing on really old technology? Probably not. In fact, if you were to take a look at the analytics, the actual stats on who actually goes to Mercedes-Benz website, I guarantee you, you're probably not looking at, you know, an audience of, you know, only 80% can use this value. It's probably closer to 99% can use this value, because that audience has a much higher adoption rate of newer technology because they can afford it. Okay, if they couldn't, they probably wouldn't be, you know, trying to buy a Mercedes-Benz. Does that make sense? So your audience can dictate whether or not to use this. All right, enough talking. So we use the RGB color mode in the web, so it only makes sense that eventually the W3C would just come out and go, hexadecimal is great, but wouldn't it be wonderful if we could just set the RGB value using the RGB value? So here's how we're going to do this. For the value and color, we're going to say RGB, and then in parentheses, give it the actual RGB value. So in this case, for red, it would be 255, comma 0, comma 0. Close parentheses. There you go. Whichever one goes, that's much easier. And I agree. But again, the problem is whether or not the people who are going to be using your site, if their browser even understands that. And again, is there a trade-off between using this value and this value? No. Right? I can render the same number of colors using hexadecimal as I can with RGB. Does that make sense? Because they're the same. They're just written differently. This color value, though, for hexadecimal has 100% adoption across the board. This one does not. This one has trade-offs. Does that make sense? So it's up to you as far as which one you want to use. I know for me personally, I typically kind of stick with hexadecimal, even though that is available to me. Now, while it probably makes sense to stick with hexadecimal when you're dealing with RGB, this fourth one may make you change your mind, because this fourth one has something up its sleeve. Up to this point, all of the colors that we have been talking about in this class are all solid colors. They're opaque. Everyone with me on the terminology here? However, I think many of you who design things in Photoshop or Illustrator are familiar with the fact that you can apply transparency to a film, right? Or transparency to a piece of text that has a color applied to it, right? Well, one of the things that the W3C did when they released the RGB color value is they released this fourth one, which is called RGBA. What does A stand for? Anyone want to guess? Alpha transparency. So, as the name suggests, we would give it the RGB color value, but there's a fourth value here, and that fourth value is the amount of transparency that you want. So I'd still do 255, 0, 0, and that fourth value is a percentage, but expressed as a decimal, is a percentage of the opacity. So, because it is a decimal, remember if I have 85%, that is 0.85. Remember this from math? Okay, 60%, 0.60. 100% is just 1. So if I put a 1 there, that's a solid red. But if I put 0.5, I now have a 50% transparent red film. And it is transparent. Anything that's behind it will come through. Which means if I have this red on a black background and I add a 50% transparency to it, to that red color, that black is going to mix with that red. Okay? It'll also help because you could use this for background colors and allow you to have background colors that add depth by the use of transparency. Now, again, The problem with this value is it suffers from the same adoption as RGB. However, there is no equivalent here using hexadecimal or the color name. Okay? These are all solid. This has the capability of being semi-transparent or fully transparent. So here's how I usually use these particular colors. If it's one of the 5, I just give it the name. I don't mess with hexadecimal. Red, green, blue, white, black. Just give it the name. Okay? My decision. You don't have to do that. That's what I do. If it is a solid color, I will set it up as hexadecimal. Period. I completely ignore this third one. If I need to include transparency, this is where I go because this is the only thing I can do. Now, I will tell you this later on. I will tell you that there are ways in our CSS, not right now with inline styles, but there are ways in our CSS where we can tell the browser, hey browser, if you support alpha transparency on an RGB, do this. Otherwise, give me the solid color. Right? Because I would rather it be solid than not show up at all, or for you to do something stupid because the browser is done. Yeah, there you go. That's what I was looking for. Okay? So there is a way to actually, in our CSS, to create what are called fallbacks. I could start with the value that I really want, but if somebody's surfing this website with an older piece of technology, let's fall back to this position, this design, just in case. Does that make sense? Now, we'll learn how to do that a little bit later. In fact, today, with one of the new properties that we're going to talk about, it's not only allowable to have a fallback, it's required to have a fallback. And I'll talk about what that is in just a little bit. But does anybody have any questions about these 4 color values?
Said with the RGBA, is that also how you can have it halfway transparent and solid onto?
No, so that would be because you're adding a gradient.
Okay.
So, well, okay, yes and no. You can use the RGBA value in a gradient to create the gradient, but those gradients are usually have, just like any gradient, they have color stops that you can set.
Oh.
It's a more complex kind of syntax, more complex grammar.
Is there like a drawback to the 4th one, like on the 3rd one?
Yeah, just like the 3rd one, the adoption, or the browsers that actually understand RGBA, is going to be in that like 70, 75%, 80% rate. Now, the number of browsers that understand RGB and RGBA are growing. Like the total global saturation of browsers that really do, render these correctly is getting more and more and more and more and more. Okay, but again, you have to remember that there is a trade-off if you're doing this. And that's why there is the capability of having a fallback. Because you need to understand, it's like, okay, if I make this decision, 80% of the people are going to be able to see it just fine, but 20% are not. So if I give the 20% a fallback, it may not look exactly the way that I want it to look like from a design perspective, but at least it'll work. Does that make sense? And these are decisions, by the way, as web designers, that you don't have to make in any other area of this industry. Right? If I'm going to go to press, if I'm going to print something like a menu, and I set a semi-transparent Pantone color, it'll print that. Right? I don't have to worry about like, well, but if the press doesn't support this, then I need to be, maybe if you're printing at Kinko's, right? Then you have to think about fallbacks. But no, you don't have to worry about fallbacks in anywhere else in the industry. What you see is what you get. But in the web, you do, because you're reliant on not what you are producing, you're reliant on what the user is using to view your work with. See, that's a big problem, right? That's a big change. So we have to be aware of what works and what doesn't work, and what works and what doesn't work, and what are the trade-offs, and how we can create these fallbacks to ensure a good user experience. And we'll get more into this. We dive deep into this kind of stuff in Web 2. Any other questions before we move on to the new properties today? Okay. All right. Now, next. again, chapter 4 in the book is all about topography. I'm asking you to read that over the weekend. So you're going to see some of the stuff in chapter 4. And chapter 4 dives a little bit deeper, and of course we will do a deep dive on Monday. But let's talk about how we can actually change some of the topography in our document. Because as of right now, by default, I don't know if I mentioned this in this class or not, but by default, what is the typeface used in the browser? What's the font?
Times.
Yeah, so not necessarily Times, it's Times New Roman. Okay? So the default, so these are the defaults. So what we call the default font, or the font family, is Times New Roman. What about the size of the font? Now, I realize it's different if you're talking about headings, but I'm talking about like paragraphs. Did I mention what the actual default size is for the, maybe I didn't.
You did, but
I did, but it was like,
yeah.
okay, that's fine. So, the font size, by default, is 16 pixels, or px. Pixels, not points. Points is for printing, like picas and inches and millimeters. We measure fonts and we measure things using the unit of pixels, because that is what the display uses, is a pixel. Now again, we're going to do a deep dive into this a little bit more on Monday, and there's something you need to understand about how pixels are actually rendered in different computers, because it's not all the same. But by default, and by the way, these defaults are all defined by the W3C. So the default font family we've got is Times New Roman. The default font size is 16 pixels. So write that down somewhere. Meaning, if I don't do anything, if I don't change anything, if I don't adjust the style of any of my text, unless it's a heading, because headings are slightly different, but all text is going to be rendered in Times New Roman, and all copy, all basic text, paragraphs, lists, doesn't matter if it's anchor tags, it's all going to be set to 16 pixels in size. Okay? So, how do we change this? Well, thankfully, we have two properties that allow us to do that. They are font family and font size. Odd how that worked out. Font family and font size. I'm going to start with font size first. Now notice, these properties are two words, and I mentioned on Monday, when we're talking about background color, whenever you're dealing with a multi-word property, they're hyphenated. Okay? No spaces allowed. They're hyphenated. So it's font dash size. And in fact, these properties that we're going to learn, and we're going to learn 4 of them, all fall under the category of the font properties. So these are font properties. Okay? The first one we're going to learn is font size. So, in CSS, that's your property name, the value of which is a measurement. Now, just like with color, there are multiple ways that I can actually measure type, or fonts in this case. And that's true even when we're talking about publishing, right? As in publishing, I can measure, normally you would measure type using points. But you could, if you wanted to, use picas. Right? You could use inches if you really wanted to, although that would probably be reserved for things like posters or billboards. Right? You could use millimeters if you needed to. and that's in publishing. Well, on the web, we do have multiple ways of measuring fonts. We're just going to stick today with pixels. Everything we're going to do for the next week or so is going to be in pixels only. Later on, I will teach you some of the other units of measurement because they are very, very important for you to learn. But for today, we're going to stick with pixels. So, if I want to change the size of anything in my document, inside of the style attribute, I need to apply the font size property. And then I just need to give it a size. So, if I wanted to make something ridiculously large, I can make it say 120 pixels. Notice there is no space between the number and the unit of measurement,
The unit of measurement you always
being
have to
pixels.
You always have to cite the unit.
Yes,
of measurement.
always. So unlike HTML, remember when we were dealing with images in HTML? I said HTML only understands pixels, so just write the number, right? That's HTML. This is CSS. Please understand, those are two different things. HTML only knows pixels. It doesn't know any, well, also knows percentages, but it only knows pixels. That's it. Okay? CSS does actually have a way for us to actually use things like points and picas and inches and millimeters. Because CSS isn't just for displaying our work on screens. You can also print out web pages. And CSS can be used to style a page specifically for print. And when that happens, well, that understands points and picas and inches, and it doesn't understand pixels. So there have to be ways inside of CSS to be able to do that. But for our purposes, because we are just caring about how it looks on the screen, we only care about pixels. Does this make sense? But because CSS allows for different units of measurement, you always have to define a unit of measurement. Always. Doesn't matter if we're setting the width of something or the height of something or the font size of something, you always have to define the unit of measurement, period. End of story. But when you do that, it's the number followed by the unit. There's no space. So this is 120px. All in line. If you put a space between the number and the unit, a lot of browsers won't know what you're doing and instead will think you want the font size to be 120 times the original value. 120 times 16. Yeah. So don't put a space there. Okay? No space. Sound good? Yeah. Don't do that. All right. That's it. That's all you got to know about font size. That's all. Add the font size property, give it a value, make sure you put pixels down, px, you're done. Okay? It's as simple as that. So now you have the capability of going in and actually changing the size of those fonts. You don't like the way a second level heading looks by default because the browser defines it as having like 24 pixel font. Fine, go in there and change it. Make it bigger, make it smaller, whatever you want to do. You don't like the size of your paragraphs? Go in there and change them. Okay? But here's an interesting thing about changing the font. How efficient is it if I wanted to change all of my paragraphs, instead of it being 16 pixels, to say 12 pixels in size? How efficient is it for me to have to go to every single paragraph tag and put a style attribute and put a font size property and set the value to 12 pixels? Does that sound efficient to you? No, it doesn't. If it does sound efficient for you, we can have a discussion later. It's not efficient. So, CSS has a trick up its sleeve. And that trick is called inheritance. Inheritance. You'll note that many of the terms we use in web design kind of fall back on kind of hereditary or, family kind of terms. Sibling, child, parent, inheritance, similar kind of concepts. Here is how inheritance works. Some, not all, some CSS properties are inherited by the element's children. Let me say that again. some, not all, but some CSS properties are inherited by an element's children. Some CSS properties are inherited by their parents' children. Let me give you an example. The Declaration of Independence assignment you all did. Remember the signer section? Remember how we set that up with a list and the list items? Okay. Now, if I told you I want each one of those signers' names to be set to 18 pixel font size, that's a lot of list items or anchor tags to sit there and actually add a font size to, right? Like 53 of them. Well, inheritance says certain CSS properties, font size being one of them, can be inherited by the children. So instead of me placing font size on each one of those anchor tags, if I place a font size on the list, the UL, right? There's only 13 of those. If I do that, all of the list items and all of the anchor tags, because they're children, will inherit the font size. Do you see how this works? But what if I take this one step further, right? Because inheritance goes from the parent down through the children. What is the main parent for the content of our site?
The body?
The body tag. Do we agree? So, here's a really good tip. If I want to make a blanket change in style for the entire document, and the property I need to set allows for inheritance, if I put it on the body tag, everything in my document will inherit that value. So if I want to change the default font size in my document from 16 pixels to 14 pixels, I'm going to set the font size where? On the body. And if I set the font size on the body, it doesn't matter how many paragraphs, how many lists, how many tables, it doesn't matter how many of these elements I have in the body, every single one of them will now be set to 14 pixels. Do you see how inheritance works? That is a heck of a lot more efficient than having to add a style, attribute, and font size property to every single element of my page. Which, by the way, that used to be the only way that worked in HTML. Before we had CSS, you had to actually do that in HTML. Yeah, it was not fun. Inheritance saved us a lot of time. So, that is font size. Any questions about font size? Nope. Let's move on to font family, and this is going to be the one that's going to be a little bit odd, but I think you'll start to understand why here in a minute. Font family is our second new property for today. Now notice, it doesn't say typeface, or font face, or font, right? It's font family, and that second word right there is going to be a key to how the value is actually written. Now again, Jason does a great job in chapter 4 covering this, and you're going to learn that one of the main limiting factors for us on the web is typefaces, available typefaces. Because again, this is the one area of this industry where you're not dependent upon what it is that you can produce on your computer. You're dependent upon how your work looks when somebody else views it on their computer, right? Which means, does everybody on the internet have the same fonts installed on their computer that you do? Does your cell phone have the same fonts installed on it that your desktop or laptop computer has? No. So do you see immediately, we may have a small problem here. Okay. Again, we'll do a deep dive in this a little bit more on Monday. But the issue is not everybody has the same fonts installed on their computers. So in order to help prevent a website from rendering fonts that you don't necessarily want, we have now created, or they created, WC3, a property called Font Family, which allows us not to set just one font, but allows us to set a list of fonts in the order that we want to use. Here's what I mean by this. By default, Times New Roman is the font that's used on the internet. Okay? Now notice, I'm going to write this value in quotes because if you look at Times New Roman, notice that there are spaces in that typeface. Times, space, New, space, Roman. Remember I said spaces are not a good idea in values, right? In font size, if you put a space there, it means multiply. Not good. Well, guess what? In fonts, if the font name has spaces in it, you have to surround it in quotes. Okay? Has to be surrounded in quotes. If it doesn't have a space in it, you're fine. But here's the thing. Let's assume for a moment, and this is the default, let's assume for a moment that we don't want to use Times New Roman. Okay? Well, then that means all I need to do is to change the name of my font family. So somebody give me, first off, Times New Roman. Is it a serif or a sans serif font? Serif. Good. That's good. So, it's a serif font. Let's flip it. Let's go to a sans serif font. So somebody give me a sans serif font. Which one? Arial. Okay? We can do Arial? All right, so Arial. Guess what? Works. If I put that as my font family, now everything's going to be Arial. If I put that on my body tag, right? If I go on my body tag, put a style attribute, and say font family, Arial. Guess what? Everything's going to be Arial. Except, what happens if that computer doesn't have Arial installed?
It's gonna go to the default.
Maybe.
Oh.
Right? What did I say about browsers? Browsers are,
Dumb.
there we go. Okay? I told the browser, I want my font to be Arial. And the browser goes, sure. Computer, I would like the Arial font. The computer goes, I have no idea what you're talking about. And the browser goes, okay. You're going to get some very weird behaviors. So, understanding that not everybody has the same fonts installed. And, by the way, even though there are fonts that are kind of considered universal fonts, or what we call safe fonts, we'll talk about this more on Monday, just because a font is considered safe to use does not necessarily mean that somebody's version of that font isn't corrupt on their particular computer. Font files could become corrupted. Arial is a pretty popular font. It's everywhere, but I've seen computers where the Arial font is corrupt. So if you're like, hey, I would like Arial, and the computer goes, I'd love to help you out, but here's the thing. Yeah, that file is corrupt. Sorry, I can't give it to you. And the browser goes, okay. Like, no, not okay, right? I need to tell the browser to do something else. Do you see that? This is where the concept of a fallback comes into play. And the font family, can a family be one? I mean, I guess if we're talking from a philosophical point of view, maybe. But typically, is a family one? No, right? That's an individual, not a family. This is not font individual. This is font family. So, what we are saying here to the browser is, this is the family of fonts that we want to use for this content. Which means that that family of fonts have better be similar. The first font that I actually define here is my first choice. This is what I want to use. I want to use Arial. Please give me Arial. And if the computer goes, no, well then now I need to have a fallback. So here's what we do. Put a comma, just like any other list, and we define a fallback. So somebody give me an alternative to Arial.
Helvetica.
Helvetica. Now, is Helvetica installed on every computer?
No.
Nope. It's not. So you go to the computer, you go, hey, I would like this to be in Arial. And the computer goes, it's corrupt. Okay, well, that's fine. How about Helvetica? I have no idea what you're talking about. Well, now we're stuck. We're 0 for 2.
Times New Roman.
Not a sans serif font. Now, I can keep going, can't I? I can go like, well, okay. There's a couple different variations of Helvetica I can do after this, right? Maybe Arial Black. The weights are kind of heavy on that. Here's the great thing about font family is that each font family actually has a designation, right? So for instance, Times New Roman is a serif font, right? Helvetica and Arial are sans serif fonts. So here's what we can do. Browser, I would like Arial. No. Okay, I'll take Helvetica. Have no idea what font that is. Fine. You know what? In the end, fine. Just give me whatever sans serif font you got. This is a generic fallback. I'm being specific, and now I'm falling back to a generic. And here's the thing about font family. I'm not limited to the number of fonts I list. There are some font family properties out there that will have 10 fonts listed just to try to get the right one. And if all else fails, that last one is always going to be the generic. All right? And it should always be generic. Even if I only want Arial, and I don't care about Helvetica, because it's overused, give me Arial or give me a sans serif. That's it. You should always have at least one fallback, which is the generic fallback. Okay? But if possible, try to spread it out a little bit. If you don't get your first choice, try to find an acceptable second choice. And if that doesn't work, move on to a third choice, and if you don't have one, use the generic fallback. Okay? Any questions about this? Yes?
Arial has several different types, like the bold, the semi-bold, the italic. So
And that would be considered the weight of the font, which is a great segue into our third property today. Font weight. Feng shui? No. Font weight. Font weight. Hmm? That's a style. We'll talk about that in a little bit too. Yeah. There's little different names for everything. Again, keep in mind, some of the terms you're used to in publishing, in illustration, when you're dealing with typesetting, not quite the same as it is on the web. Okay? As a designer, it drives me batty. But I didn't come up with these terminologies. So, font weight. The weight of the font. Now, normally, when we're dealing with different typefaces, they can be thin, right? They can be regular. They can be bold, semi-bold. They can be black. Yeah.
Before we get into the font weight, is there a website kind of like there is for the color to make sure that it has the fonts depending on the
Yep.
browser? Oh.
Yep. Can I use will also tell you fonts as well. Yeah. And we'll talk about that in the book. So there are a set number of what we call safe fonts. We'll talk about those on Monday. Okay? You'll be surprised by number 7. Here's your clickbait for next week. Anyway, so font weight. That is the thickness or the weight of the actual font. Now, like I said, normally you would have a normal font where you have bold or semi-bold or black or thin, right? Now, on the web, we can actually define weights in a number of ways. The 2 ways that you can set this value is either by a specific name. For instance, bold. By default, the font weight of every heading, H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, H6, is bold. That is the property that's applied by default to all headings. By default, a paragraph has a normal font weight. Typically, you're going to use one of those 2. But because there are fonts that have different levels of weights, there is a numerical system that you can use. That numerical system has 9 different levels. Each level is basically a multiple of 100. Or not a multiple, but it's going up in 100. So it's either 100 or 200 or 300 or 400 or 500, going all the way up to 900. The larger the number, the thicker the font. So if you've ever seen fonts that are like, you know, extra black fonts, okay, that would be a weight of 900. If you've ever seen like ultra thin fonts, that would be a weight of 100. 400 is a normal weight font. Usually 600 is considered bold. 500 would be semi-bold. See how that works? Now, that numbering system did not come from the web. That actually comes from ye olden days of lead typesetting. That was how they used to measure the weight of the fonts. Okay, so that is a standard in typography. But for the most part, what we are going to be using font weight for in this class is usually to make things bold that aren't bold, right? Or make things that aren't bold regular again. Now, any questions about this so far? All right, so we have gone over font size. We have gone over font family. We have gone over font weight. The other question was, well, wait a minute. What about italics? How do we do that? Well, there is another font property. Surprise, surprise. And this one is called font style. And we simply set the value to italic. Questions about this? So now you know how to style text that isn't bold to make it bold, that isn't italic to make it italic. You know how to actually set the style to change the default font family from Times New Roman to something else, and even give it a fallback. And you also know how to change the size of your fonts. In addition to that, you can add color 4 different ways. Questions? Yep.
So what if you want to have like any font families in one paragraph? So you just copy?
Yeah, so good question. So like let's say if you wanted the overall paragraph to be in Helvetica, but there's a sentence in the middle of that that you want it to be in Times New Roman. Is that what you're saying? Something like that? Okay. There are ways to do that, but in order for us to learn that, we have to understand another concept in HTML called structural tags. We'll talk about that later in a few weeks. So there is ways to be able to do that, right? But there has to be a way to tell the browser, this text I need to style differently from this other text. In order for that to happen, we actually have to define, find a way to actually define that. And there are tags that allow us to do this. So we'll talk about those tags later on. Any other questions? It's a good thought. Yeah, and by the way, as we get further into this discussion of CSS, there are going to be things that you have done in design, or you have done things in, like, say, Illustrator or InDesign, and you're like, well, yeah, but how could I do that here, right? And you're going to be limited because we haven't quite gotten through everything yet when it comes to structuring our content. Once we get to the part where you really start to understand how to do layout and structure, then we're going to put all these pieces together and it'll start to make sense. It'll start to click at that point. And you'll start to be able to see things in your design that you can pull from other areas, other print-based design styles that you can actually apply within your websites. Any other questions? Okay, so let's talk about the assignment.